When I was 20 years old, my ex-husband and I moved into a rental property in a relatively nice suburb outside Chicago. In the basement of the house was a big mother-in-law suite, where a good male friend of ours, Nick, lived as well. At this time, I was about halfway through nursing school. During this particular semester of school, I had a very early clinical rotation once a week. I am not a morning person, so in order to maximize my sleep, I load all my stuff into the car the night before. Bags, books, and even my purse. One night before clinicals, I asked my then-husband Bob to get a book from my car. He does so, but forgot to lock the door. The next morning, I noticed that my purse was gone, and proceeded to file a police report. I was concerned because I had also started a new job as a nurse's aide at a hospital, and my social security card was still in my wallet inside the purse. Almost immediately after the theft, strange things started to happen. We started getting ding-dong ditches throughout all hours of the day, night included. Someone vandalized all of our cars with strange graffiti, such as Nazi swastikas and hangmen. Additionally, they egged our house and slashed Nick's tires. At first, we chalked it up to neighborhood pranksters, but when we started having damages that cost decent money, we had to call the police. One day, when Bob was mowing the lawn, he noticed piles of cigarette butts outside the bedroom window. The police came and took a report, but they couldn't do anything else. They could only suggest to invest in car alarms and some brighter floodlights for the driveway. A few weeks later, I received a call on my cell phone around 2:30 a.m. from the police in a neighboring town. They had picked up someone who had my ID on him. His name was Craig J. When they asked why he had someone else's ID on him, he claimed I was his girlfriend. A cop called me because my name had popped up that I had previously filed a police report for theft. I assured the cops that I'd never heard of him before, and was told that I could pick up my ID at the police station within the next few days. It was then that things really started to escalate. Unfortunately, at the time, I didn't think the following incidents were related. I started getting strange messages on Facebook and MySpace, clearly from fake accounts, with long-winded messages that made no sense. The messages didn't stop at me. This person started messaging friends of mine as well. I decided to delete my MySpace account and block the person on Facebook. However, new accounts kept getting created. Somehow, this person also got a hold of my email address and began sending emails as well. I had no idea who this person could be, but they seemed to know details about me that indicated it was either someone I knew or knew someone I knew. The messages they sent weren't overtly threatening, but creepy enough to make me uncomfortable. Then, one night, my friend Lauren and I were sitting on the couch watching TV. Lauren's husband, John, and a few other friends had gone out for the night. As we sat around, we heard something that sounded like someone shaking the garage door. I went and checked the garage, but nothing seemed out of the ordinary. We had occasional issues with raccoons, so I chalked it up to that. However, the noise kept continuing. Lauren and I were freaked out at this point. The sounds moved from the garage to the kitchen window. It then sounded like someone was knocking on and vigorously scratching the window. We called our husbands, but they didn't answer. At this point, we debated calling the police. However, we didn't want to seem foolish, because it may have been an animal, or the tree branches. As we debated, I noticed Lauren's face become sheet white as she looked past me. I spun around and could see the locked handle to the front door wiggling. We jumped out of our seats and went straight to the kitchen. Lauren grabbed a knife from the butcher block on the counter, while I grabbed a small hammer from the junk drawer. We booked it to the back of the house where the bedrooms were, cell phones in hand, lock ourselves in one of the bedrooms, and call the police. The dispatcher instructs us to stay on the line, move furniture in front of the door if possible, and that the police are on their way. We shove a dresser in front of the door, still clinging to the knife and hammer. We agreed that if this fucker got in, he's not going down without a fight, even if he is bigger and stronger than we were. The plan was for Lauren to go for his gut with the knife, and I would go for his head with the hammer. However, the cops show up first, banging on the front door, shouting, "Police!" We could see the red and blue lights through the window. We proceeded to leave the room, let the cops in, and they searched, but found no signs of anyone present or evidence of an attempted break-in. While they took their report, our husbands finally called us back. They came home, and the cops left. Flash forward to a few months later. A close friend of ours, Sean, was renovating his apartment and needed a place to crash along with his girlfriend. Bob and I decide he could stay in the third bedroom in our house. That first night Sean stays with us, we are awakened at 2 a.m. by Sean screaming at someone. Bob and I jump out of bed, rush into the hall, and go into Sean's room. Sean and his girlfriend are wide awake, lights on, and look like they had just saw a ghost. The screen to the window was sliced and flopping in the wind. Sean told us he woke up to someone using what he thought was a knife on the screen and started climbing in through the window. We eventually call the cops, and they come out to take a statement. Sean describes the guy as best he could. A white male, young, semi-shaved head, and darker hair. The cops dust for fingerprints, which come back with a match. They belonged to Craig J. As it turned out, I vaguely knew who he was. He was a year younger than I, and we had gone to the same high school. However, I couldn't remember having any significant interactions with him. He lived with his parents only a few blocks from my parents' house. I ended up reaching out to high school acquaintances who knew him, and they remembered him as a nice but odd kid, kind of quiet, but definitely on the strange side, who had dropped out of school right before graduation. Upon realizing that Sean had just moved in, the cop pointed out something extremely unsettling. That this man likely assumed no one was staying in this bedroom, and likely planned to stay in it inconspicuously. The cops would subsequently find and arrest Craig. But upon his arrest, he had quite the story. He claimed that he and I were secret lovers, in a relationship, but that I was currently ignoring him. He also stated that he had, quote, been allowed into my home many times. I was floored. He was charged with trespassing and breaking and entering, but only did light time for it, maybe a month, and had to pay a fine. In the meantime, I got a restraining order on him. He eventually did get out, but I luckily had no more contact from him. During this time, I developed a completely irrational fear of first-floor windows. A couple of years later, Bob and I divorced and went our separate ways. Our friend Nick had long since moved out. We then ended the lease, and I moved into a less desirable suburb, but with affordable rent. I settled on an apartment in a 4-unit building that had a locked entrance, and the only way in was with a key or with someone opening the door from the inside. My unit was on the 2nd floor. By this time, I had graduated nursing school and worked at a nursing home. Life was proceeding as normal, and I figured the whole Craig thing was behind me. Unfortunately, those initial years were just the beginning. I began receiving calls at my work, only to have someone hang up when I finally answered. Letters suddenly appeared in the staff-only mailbox, mailed specifically to me, but with no return address. The strange emails from before started up again from random accounts. The messages were never overtly threatening, but they were long, way too frequent, way too out there. This person spoke to me as if we were long-lost friends, like we had some sort of connection. A sense of dread befell me. It had to be Craig again. My previous experiences with him rushed to me like an unstoppable wave. Despite the fact he never actually threatened me, he did previously force himself into my last residence with a knife. How could I not be uneasy? From all his rambling throughout the years, I figured he must have had some sort of crush on me when we were younger, even though I never spoke to him. He believed that he, just happening to rob my car a couple of years ago, was some sort of sign from the universe, and that we were meant to be together. I reported this to the cops, but because there weren't any actual threats, there wasn't much they could do but watch and wait. The one-sided correspondence went on for a while, until finally, one night at 2 a.m., I woke up to the doorbell ringing. I'm instantly on guard. I peer out the window, and there, illuminated in the floodlight, is Craig. I burst out crying, and in my half-awake state, I ran across the hall and started banging on my neighbor's door. He was an older divorced guy who lived alone. He goes downstairs, confronts Craig, and tells him the cops have been called. Thankfully, Craig takes off. Soon after, I'm filing yet another police report, and the police claim that they would talk to him. However, this only made things worse. Before long, my Facebook friends start getting random messages from Craig, asking about me, and telling them he has important information for me. Other times, he says that I owe him money, and a debt needs to be paid off. My friends eventually block him. However, he doesn't stop there. My younger sister lived in the city with a few friends. He somehow finds out her address, drives to her apartment, and confronts her while she has company over. She freaks out and subsequently kicks him out. She calls the cops, who again state that since he didn't commit a crime, they can only offer her a restraining order. My sister wasn't the only family member who had a run-in with Craig. One of my younger cousins at the time was on his high school cross-country team. Craig shows up at his practice, with my cousin obviously having no clue who he is. He approached my cousin and started demanding information about me. However, the coach got involved, who Craig then gets into a fight with. Once again, the cops are called. Craig is banned from the school's grounds, but nothing more. The harassment continues as he calls the nursing home administrator at my job, once again asking to talk to me and saying that he has important information to tell me. My administrator tells him not to come onto the property or he will have him arrested for trespassing. At this point, I'm paranoid beyond measure. However, just as quickly as it started, it faded off once again. Another year has passed, and there have been no signs of Craig. A friend of mine, Stacy, moved in with me temporarily as she looked for a new place. She was dating a new guy and spent quite a few nights at his place. One day, I decided to pick up a double shift, which started at 7 a.m. and ended at 11 p.m. Stacy texts me around 3 p.m., saying that she won't be home that night and will be out with her boyfriend. It's almost midnight by the time I arrive home, and the first thing I notice is that the door is unlocked. My heart starts to race, my body on full alert. For a second, I thought it was possible that Stacy had simply forgotten to lock the door before she left. She was from the country, and for her, it was normal practice to leave the door unlocked and wide open. However, we were in the suburbs, and I also informed her about my past incidents with Craig. Thus, she should know that the front door must be double locked and that 1 or 2 lights should always be on. Still, I decided to slightly creak the door open and cautiously peer inside. It didn't even take half a second to realize that the apartment was pitch black. My instincts go on overdrive, telling me to get the hell out of there. I booked it downstairs and frantically burst into one of my neighbor's units, who was having one of his usual weekend parties. I went straight to him, pleading for him to come with me to check out my unit, nervously explaining that things were out of the ordinary, and that I suspected I may have an intruder. He looks at me like I'm crazy, but eventually agrees to accompany me. When we arrived at my unit, we looked around, but saw nobody. I started to question my own sanity and paranoia, once again thinking it was simply Stacy who forgot to leave a light on and lock the door. As I tell my neighbor that this was likely the case, he has a laugh and starts joking about ghosts while opening one of the pantry doors. What I saw next will never, ever leave my mind. There, crouched inside, is Craig. Immediately, my neighbor puts him in a chokehold. They struggle and fumble around for a short period of time, but my neighbor gains the upper hand and subdues him. He instructed me to call the police, who arrived in minutes and promptly arrested Craig. To this day, it still chills me to think about what he planned on doing to me. I often wonder how he got access to the apartment complex. Chances are he was simply able to walk in through the alleyway door, since my neighbor purposely kept it open for the guests of his party. Naturally, people would assume he was one of the guests. Craig ended up being charged and convicted of aggravated stalking, breaking and entering, and other charges. His parents, whom I met in court, were surprisingly both very normal people. They were very apologetic towards me and tried explaining that Craig was mentally ill and suffered from bipolar disorder. When he's medicated, he's okay. But when he's off his meds, he's nuts, his parents said. Craig served time for several years, but eventually would be released. I have an acquaintance who monitors him on Facebook. From what she tells me, he appears to go through periods of inactivity, then episodes where he is rambling, overposting, oversharing, and acting deranged. His parents must have been telling the truth. It's obvious when he isn't taking his meds. Part of me actually feels bad for him. I'm older now, and I've been a nurse for almost 10 years, with some time even spent in the psych specialty. The mind is a hell of a thing. Looking back, those were some of the worst years of my adult life. He put me through a lot of anxiety and caused a lot of issues for me. The crippling paranoia is the worst part. For the remainder of the time I lived in the apartment where I last saw Craig, I would sleep at night with my couch pushed against my apartment door. I've remarried since then, but on nights when I'm home alone, I still have to resist the urge to stack furniture by the front door. I also recall a time where I once parked my car near a baseball diamond and found a baseball-sized spider crack on my windshield. Despite it being completely logical that it was most likely a foul ball, I instantly thought it to be Craig, even though I've had no further contact with him. There is one last bit of information from this ordeal. Craig either sold, lost, or gave away my social security card that was in my purse from when he broke into my car all those years back. It led to someone using the file for Medicaid benefits in Arizona, who subsequently got a job under my identity, failed to pay any taxes, and then left me with a surprise asset freeze by the IRS. It was a gigantic financial mess. It took a while before they could unfreeze my accounts and pay me back the money they pulled from my paychecks for the back taxes I had nothing to do with. My credit suffered for years because of it, and to this day, I have a lock on my social security number and monitor my accounts like a hawk. Everything in my life that could have a lock has one. I'm a complete stickler about locks. And how could I not be? Twice, my life got screwed up because doors weren't locked. My car door, and most likely my apartment door. The moral of the story? Never leave your purse in the car, and always lock your doors. This memory from a year ago popped into my head, and I want to share it because I was so shocked at that moment. I realize now how scary the situation was, and it was just super strange. Keep in mind, this story is hard to describe, but I'll try my best. I met my dad at a tire shop in an increased crime area of town. Not really sure why we went to this shop. It was probably around noon. My dad brought his chihuahua with him, so I took her on a walk around the tire shop while he consulted with the mechanics. The shop was about half a football field away from a busy street, with a big field in between the shop and the street, in an otherwise residential area. I figured it was safe enough to walk the dog around in the field because my dad and the mechanics were right there. However, the shop was fenced in and not facing the field, so in retrospect, it wasn't actually that safe for me because neither my dad nor the employees could see me. I began walking the dog around this field, not too close to the busy street. Suddenly, this beat-up car starts driving really slow on the busy street. The windows are down, and I can tell the driver was staring at me. The street is somewhat far away from me, and he eventually drives past, so I pay him no mind. But then, a couple seconds later, I see the car again going down the street in the opposite direction, going really fast, and he turns onto the side street where I am. He's driving extremely fast, and just guns it into the field where I'm walking the dog, literally jumping the curb. He's coming straight for me, very fast, and I'm stuck standing there, shocked. In my head, I'm thinking, is he about to plow us down? What the fuck is happening? It was happening so quickly and unexpectedly. In my confused shock, I'm hesitating with the dog, contemplating running away, but also not wanting to turn my back on the car. Then, miraculously, there was some kind of uneven ground or a hole that caught one of the wheels of his car. With his windows down, I can hear him cursing, and I took that moment to scoop up the dog and get the hell out of there. Then, he opens the car door and gets out of the car. Because I was so shocked in this situation, I can't recall most of the details of how this man looked, other than the fact that he was overweight. Right at that moment, a truck pulls up beside us with two youngish men inside. It seemed to be a construction truck. The men roll down their windows and ask me if this guy is bothering me. They say it loudly, which ends up spooking the guy, and he goes back into his car. He is eventually able to peel out in reverse from the hole his car was stuck in. He very quickly proceeds to reverse out from the field we're in, back onto the street, and zooms off. The kind men who stopped apparently saw all this happen, and were just as confused as I was. What was this man's game plan? What was he attempting? Was he trying to kidnap me in broad daylight, even though there were people around? I'll never know. But I was really lucky that his car got stuck, so I didn't have to find out. It was all just very strange. I'm grateful that his car got stuck, and I'm grateful for the men who drove by and were willing to check out the situation. We chatted for a second after the man left, and were all very confused about what had happened. I can be overconfident at times about my safety, but after a handful of other strange, potentially dangerous encounters, I've learned to always be alert. Bad things can happen anytime and anywhere. So many times I've frozen instead of fighting or taking any kind of action. Thankfully, my guardian angels have my back, but I won't take them for granted. Back in 2014, I moved to England from Canada to gain work and travel experience, but also to find myself. I ended up living in Essex with 3 other roommates. They were all women as well, all a bit older than I was. I was 24, Megan was 31, Cherry was 34, and Cassie was 38. Megan was from New York, Cherry from New Jersey, and Cassie from Poland. All 4 of us shared this 3-story flat. The back of our home had the living room and kitchen, and the back wall was completely made of glass that looked out into the garden, which was completely fenced in. The house had an interesting dynamic, to say the least. I adored all my roommates, except for Cherry. After living with Cherry for 7 months, I was tired of her antics. When she would go out to dinner with her work friends, she often came back drunk, which was usually followed by a full-blown tantrum. I absolutely hated listening to her scream crying. Thus, when I came home from work, after making myself something to eat, I would go to my room, lock the door, and immediately put on my headphones. It's especially helpful when I bring home work from my job. On one particular night, I'm doing work in my room as usual, with my headphones blasting music. I'm completely focused, until I feel something. I look up to see a man standing over me. It doesn't register in my head right away, and I passively say, "Cherry's room is on the 2nd floor," and continue to work. Cherry regularly brought strange men home, so I didn't think this time was any different. The problem was, he didn't leave. Again, I tell the man, "Cherry's room is downstairs." He then interrupts with, "I'm not here for Cherry." A cold chill was sent through my veins, and my fight or flight kicked in. I started surveying the situation. I look him up and down. He has a bottle of Prosecco in one hand, and a knife in the other. He's about 5'10", wild muddy brown hair, and black eyes. He was wearing a light blue polo shirt, with one side of his collar popped up, and had a distinct Manchester accent. After a few seconds, I realized his eyes were black because his pupils were completely dilated. In that moment I thought, shit, I'm in trouble. I need an escape plan. Unfortunately, this man was standing in between me and my bedroom door. I needed to get downstairs, but I had to make him think it was his idea. I had to keep my cool. Just then, he uses his knife to pop the cork. Prosecco starts flowing onto my carpet. I tell him, "Oh no, let's clean that up. I prefer to drink out of a proper flute anyways." He nodded and replied, "Yeah, you're a proper classy bird. Let's go." I try to act as natural as possible, trying not to show that I'm shaking all over and struggling to gain control over my breathing. We take the long, 3-floor journey down to the main floor of my flat. As we go down, I can feel that he has the back of my nightgown bunched up with one hand and continues to hold the knife with his other. Only this time, I could feel the tip of the blade against my back. I was trying to playfully speak with him as we walked down the stairs. I was mostly rambling, and my heart was racing faster than ever. When we get to the bottom of the stairs, there's a hallway to my left that leads to the front door. On my right, which is much closer to us, is the kitchen and the living room. We make our way into the kitchen, and I point to the cabinets that had the wine glasses. He said he knew where they were and moved towards them. With a kitchen table in between us, I decided it was time to run. I burst into a sprint down the hallway towards the door. My hands fumble over the locks, shaking and sweating. I swing open the door and see 2 men walking across the street. They must have been walking home from the train, as there was a big train station in front of our home. I call out to them for help, when suddenly, I'm forcefully flung onto the ground. The little pebbles I landed on viciously scraped my skin. The intruder pushed me out of the way to try and run and escape. One of the men chased after him, while the other said for me to go inside while he surveyed my home and instructed me to call the police. Once I got in and locked the doors, I proceeded to call the police. While I was on the phone with dispatch, I manically ran around the house to double-check all the windows and doors. Suddenly, I hear a loud bang at the door. I informed dispatch of the banging, and she informed me that the police weren't there yet. I thought it might be one of the gentlemen who helped me. I looked out the eye hole, and it's him, the intruder. He came back. He's banging on my door, screaming that I had his glasses and that he was not done with me. I absolutely freak out. The dispatcher attempts to calm me down, but I am losing my ever-loving mind. At that moment, she said, "Officers are pulling into your street now. You should hear their sirens." I did. Thank God. The intruder then blasts off. One officer jumps out of the passenger side while the car is still moving and chases after him. The second officer comes into my home, interviews me, the 2 gentlemen, collects evidence, and takes photos. After some time, Cherry finally comes home and freaks out. Once the situation was explained to her, she says, "Oh my God, that could have been me." Yeah, thanks, Cherry. It's always about you. The next morning, I am called in to identify a man they had in custody. I pointed him out. I go into a little room, and the officer pulls out an evidence bag, and he asks me if the items were mine. They were. There had been underwear and photos taken from my home. The officer informed me that the intruder had been stalking me for some time now. He estimated around 3 months. He made a nest outside our home on top of a hill that overlooked our living room and kitchen. He is a known sex offender and drug dealer. He then told me how lucky I was to get out practically unharmed, as others weren't so lucky. To the man who stalked me and broke into my home, let's not meet again. However, I would love to run into those 2 gentlemen again. Every day, I'm thankful for them.